Judge William Crawford had always prided himself on his sharp mind, impeccable reputation, and unshakable authority in the courtroom. He had seen countless cases, handed down hundreds of verdicts, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he had seen it all. But on this particular morning, as he adjusted his black robe and took his seat on the bench, he had no idea that fate had prepared a lesson for him, one he would never forget. The case before him seemed routine. A young woman, barely in her 20s, was representing the defendant. The moment she stepped forward, Judge Crawford barely concealed his smirk. She was young, yes, but more than that, she was black. And in his courtroom, in this old southern town, he had never seen someone like her stand at the attorney's table with such confidence. Her name was Maya Lawson. She carried herself with quiet grace, but Crawford saw through it, or so he thought. He had dealt with her kind before. Ambitious, eager, but ultimately naive. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "Miss Lawson, are you sure you're in the right place? The public gallery is that way." He gestured toward the back of the courtroom, a chuckle escaping his lips. The other attorneys, all older white men, smirked. The bailiff coughed to hide his amusement. Maya, however, did not flinch. She merely smiled, her deep brown eyes steady. "I appreciate the clarification, Your Honor, but I assure you, I am exactly where I'm supposed to be." Judge Crawford narrowed his eyes. He decided to test her, to break her. "Tell me, Miss Lawson, how long have you been practicing law? You look like you just walked out of a college classroom." A few snickers echoed through the courtroom. But Maya didn't waver. She simply opened her case file, adjusted her glasses, and responded. Long enough to know that when a judge mocks an attorney before the proceedings even begin, he risks showing bias. And long enough to know that bias can be grounds for judicial review. The smirk on Crawford's face froze. The room went silent. And then, Maya began. What happened next was nothing short of extraordinary. With precise, calculated arguments, she dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece. Every question she posed was a trap, every statement a masterstroke. Witnesses faltered under her cross-examinations, their testimonies unraveling like loose threads in an unraveling sweater. She cited obscure laws that no one in the courtroom had thought to use. She referenced past cases that left even the most experienced attorneys scrambling through their notes. And then, the final blow. She turned to Judge Crawford, her voice calm but commanding. "Your Honor, I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges." Crawford scoffed. "On what grounds?" Maya stepped forward, holding up a document. "On the grounds that the key witness for the prosecution has been proven unreliable, the evidence tampered with, and, most importantly, because the law demands it." She placed the document before him. Crawford read it. His face paled. She was right. Silence stretched across the room. The same men who had laughed at her just an hour ago now looked at her with something else entirely, respect, and perhaps even fear. Judge Crawford cleared his throat. Case dismissed. His voice was quieter now, devoid of mockery. As Maya gathered her papers, she turned to him one last time. "Thank you, Your Honor." Her voice carried no arrogance, only quiet dignity. For the first time in years, Judge Crawford felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. It was shame, but also admiration. He had misjudged her, underestimated her. And today, in his own courtroom, the law had humbled him. Maya Lawson walked out of the courthouse that day, her head held high. She didn't just win a case, she changed a man. And sometimes, that was the most powerful verdict of all. Judge William Crawford sat in his chambers long after the courtroom had emptied, staring at the dismissal order in front of him. His hands, steady after years of signing judgments with certainty, trembled ever so slightly. He had prided himself on being a fair man. A strong man. A man who understood the law better than anyone. But today, a young black woman had made him feel small in a way he never had before. Not through insults, not through anger, but through something far more devastating, undeniable brilliance. For the first time in years, he questioned himself. Had he been wrong all these years? Had he dismissed people like Maya Lawson before they even had a chance to prove themselves? Had he failed to be the man he thought he was? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in." The door opened, and to his surprise, Maya stood there. She held no grudge in her eyes, no triumph in her expression, just calm curiosity. "May I speak with you, Your Honor?" Crawford hesitated before nodding. "Of course." Maya stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She didn't sit, didn't make herself comfortable. She simply stood there, her gaze steady. "I imagine this isn't the first time you've looked at someone like me and assumed I didn't belong here," she said softly, without malice. Crawford exhaled slowly. He had spent decades controlling every room he walked into. And yet, in this moment, he felt like the student instead of the teacher. "No," he admitted. "It's not." A silence stretched between them. Not hostile. Not angry. Just real. Maya nodded as if she had expected his answer. "I grew up watching men like you decide the fates of people like me. My father, he spent years fighting cases he should have won, but no one ever gave him a fair shot. I watched him come home, tired, defeated, but never broken. He told me once that the law wasn't about justice, it was about who held the power to define it." Crawford swallowed hard. "And you? What do you believe?" Maya smiled. "I believe that power changes hands when someone demands it." She took a step closer. "And today, I demanded it." Crawford let out a slow breath. "You did." She studied him for a moment. "You're not a bad judge, Your Honor. But you were a blind one today." Crawford felt those words settle deep inside him. Not a wound, no, something more complex. A truth he could no longer ignore. Finally, he looked up at her, the weight of years of unspoken bias pressing against him. "I won't be blind again." Maya studied him for a long moment. Then, with a small nod, she turned and walked toward the door. But just as she reached it, she paused. Without looking back, she said, "You know, my father always told me something else." Crawford's voice was quiet. "What's that?" Maya's hand rested on the doorframe. "The best judges aren't the ones who think they know everything. They're the ones who are willing to learn." And with that, she was gone. Crawford sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space where she had stood. And for the first time in his long career, he didn't feel like the one handing down the verdict. He felt like the one receiving it. Judge William Crawford didn't sleep that night. Maya Lawson's words echoed in his mind, forcing him to face something he had spent years avoiding, his own reflection, unfiltered and unflattering. He had always seen himself as a fair man, a man of justice. But fairness wasn't just about following the law, it was about recognizing the people standing before him as people. And today, he had failed. For the first time in his long career, he felt the need to atone. The next morning, before court was in session, Crawford did something he had never done before. He researched her. Maya Lawson. She had graduated top of her class at Howard University, earning her law degree at Yale. She had clerked under some of the most respected legal minds in the country, and yet, here she was, arguing cases in a small southern courtroom where men like him barely gave her a second glance. But the part that struck him the most wasn't her credentials. It was why she had chosen this place. She had turned down high-profile firms, lucrative offers, a life of comfort. Instead, she had come back to fight for people who had never been given a fair chance. People Crawford himself had overlooked. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. How many Mayas had he ignored? How many had he dismissed before they even spoke? It wasn't an easy question. And the answer was even harder to accept. A new trial. 2 weeks later, Maya was back in his courtroom. A new case. A new client. But this time, the air was different. Crawford sat on the bench, his face unreadable, but Maya noticed the shift immediately. There was no smirk, no mocking remark. Just a quiet attentiveness that hadn't been there before. She began her arguments, sharp as ever, but as the case progressed, something unusual happened. Crawford asked questions. Real questions. Not the kind meant to trip her up or belittle her, but questions that challenged the prosecution's claims, that dug into the flaws she had exposed. He wasn't just listening, he was engaged. When the prosecution objected to one of her motions, Crawford paused for a long moment. Then, in a firm voice, he said, "Overruled." "Proceed, Miss Lawson." Maya held his gaze for a second longer than necessary. And in that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. Not approval. Not forgiveness. But recognition. By the time the trial ended, the change was undeniable. Crawford had ruled fairly, not just by the letter of the law, but by its spirit. And for the first time, Maya saw him as something she never expected, capable of growth. As she packed up her files, he did something else unexpected. He stood. "Miss Lawson," he called as she reached the door. She turned, eyebrows raised. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, with a nod, he said the words she never thought she'd hear from a man like him. "Well argued." Maya smiled, not triumphant, not boastful, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had done more than just win a case. She had changed a mind. And sometimes, that was the greatest victory of all. Epilogue: The legacy of a lesson. Years later, when Judge Crawford retired, a new judge took his place. Her name? The Honorable Maya Lawson. The same courtroom. The same bench. But a very different future. Judge William Crawford sat in the gallery, watching as the courtroom he had ruled over for decades was now presided over by someone he had once underestimated. Judge Maya Lawson. It had been years since their first encounter, the day he had tried to belittle her, only to be humbled by her brilliance. And now, as he sat among the very people he used to tower over, he saw the future unfolding before him. The courtroom felt different under Maya's leadership. There was no air of intimidation, no silent understanding that power belonged to the privileged few. Instead, there was justice, raw and unfiltered, handled with grace and unwavering determination. Crawford watched as Maya listened to each case with the same precision she had shown that first day. But what struck him the most was how she treated people, the defendants, the attorneys, even the nervous public defenders struggling through their arguments. She didn't just hear them. She saw them. It was something he had failed to do for far too long. An unexpected reunion. As the court adjourned for the day, Crawford stood, debating whether to slip out unnoticed. But before he could move, Maya's voice cut through the noise. "Your Honor?" Crawford turned. She was standing at the bench, watching him with that same knowing look she had given him years ago. Only this time, there was something else in her gaze. Not triumph. Not resentment. Something softer. Understanding. He walked toward her, feeling a strange mix of emotions, pride, humility, and something that almost felt like relief. I always wondered what it would feel like to sit in that gallery, he admitted, glancing at the emptying courtroom. It's a different view from here. Maya tilted her head. And what do you see? He let out a slow breath, looking around the room that had once been his domain. I see the law the way it was always meant to be. His gaze met hers. And I see the right person up there. A small, knowing smile crossed Maya's face. Well, Your Honor, I appreciate the vote of confidence. Crawford chuckled, shaking his head. You don't need it. You never did. Maya studied him for a long moment. Then, she did something unexpected. She extended her hand. For years, she had been the young attorney he had dismissed. The woman he had underestimated. The force he had been unprepared for. But now? Now, she was his equal. No, his successor. Crawford grasped her hand, the handshake firm, filled with something words couldn't quite capture. Respect. Growth. Change. As he turned to leave, he stopped at the door and glanced back one last time. There she stood, behind the very bench that had once been his. A symbol of everything the world had tried to deny her. And as he walked out into the evening light, Crawford realized that his greatest verdict hadn't been one he had handed down. It was the one he had finally accepted. Judge William Crawford had always believed that legacies were carved in stone, unchangeable, etched by time and tradition. But as he stepped out of the courthouse that evening, he realized something profound. Legacies could be rewritten. And Maya Lawson had rewritten his. The invitation. Months passed, and Crawford found himself in a strange new rhythm. Retirement suited him in some ways. He no longer carried the burden of verdicts, nor the weight of lives decided in his courtroom. But something felt unfinished. Then, one day, an envelope arrived at his doorstep. The letterhead was official. The United States Court of Appeals. Inside was a formal invitation, and below it, a handwritten note. Your Honor. I think it's time for another lesson. I hope to see you there. Judge Maya Lawson. Crawford exhaled sharply, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Maya had been appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals, one of the most prestigious judicial positions in the country. And she wanted him there to witness it. A seat in the back row. The ceremony was grand, held in Washington, D.C., filled with some of the most powerful legal minds in the nation. Crawford sat quietly in the back, unnoticed by most, but his eyes never left the woman at the center of it all. Maya stood tall as she took her oath, her voice steady, her presence commanding. And as she signed her name into the official record, sealing her place in history, Crawford felt something unexpected stir in his chest. Pride. Not the kind that came from power or prestige. But the pride of knowing that he, a man once blind to his own biases, had lived long enough to see the world change. And, in a small way, to change with it. After the ceremony, as the crowd congratulated her, Maya turned, searching the room. Her eyes found him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, she walked over, that same knowing smile on her lips. Still sitting in the back, Your Honor? Crawford let out a soft chuckle. Seems to be the best seat in the house these days. Maya studied him for a moment. Then, in a voice filled with quiet sincerity, she said, I'm glad you came. Crawford nodded. I wouldn't have missed it for the world. She hesitated, then leaned in slightly. You know, there's always room for one more mentor in the next generation. Crawford blinked, caught off guard. You want me to teach? Maya tilted her head. You learned something once. Maybe it's time you pass that lesson on. Crawford considered her words, the weight of them settling into his bones. He had spent so many years believing his way was the only way. But what if his real legacy wasn't in the verdicts he had handed down, but in the lessons he had learned along the way? Finally, he nodded, a slow, thoughtful smile forming. Maybe it is. Maya grinned. Then it looks like your next case is waiting. And with that, she disappeared into the crowd, leaving Crawford standing there, older, wiser, and, for the first time in years, ready for his next chapter. Epilogue, the final lesson. Years later, in a law classroom filled with eager students, an old man stood at the podium. The law isn't just about power, William Crawford said, his voice steady. It's about those who demand it. A young black woman in the front row took notes furiously, her expression thoughtful. Crawford paused, looking at her, then glanced at the name on her binder. Danielle Lawson. He smiled. Maya's niece. Legacies, he realized, were not set in stone. They were passed down. And this time, he was proud of the one he was leaving behind. The classroom had fallen into a thoughtful silence, the weight of Crawford's words settling over the students like the final moments of a powerful closing argument. Danielle Lawson sat in the front row, her pen hovering over her notebook, eyes locked onto the old man at the podium. There was something familiar in her gaze, sharp, hungry for knowledge, unafraid to challenge authority. Just like her aunt. Crawford let the silence linger. It was a trick he had learned from Maya. Sometimes, the most powerful thing a teacher could do was give their students space to think. Then, slowly, a hand rose in the back of the room. Professor Crawford? A young man with wire-rimmed glasses cleared his throat. You were a judge for decades. You had power. Why did it take you so long to change? The room tensed. It was a bold question. But Crawford only nodded, as if he had been waiting for it. He glanced down at his old hands, the same hands that had once signed orders and passed sentences without a second thought. Because I thought I knew everything. His voice was quiet, but steady. And there's nothing more dangerous than a man in power who refuses to learn. Danielle's pen scratched across the paper. Another student spoke up. And how did you know when you had changed? Crawford let out a slow breath, his mind drifting back to the courtroom, to Maya standing before him, unwavering in the face of his arrogance. The day I stopped talking and started listening. A shadow in the gallery. Months passed, and Crawford found himself drawn back to an old place, the courtroom where he had once sat high above the rest, where his word had been final. Only now, he took a seat in the gallery. Judge Maya Lawson presided with the same quiet power she had always carried. But now, she wasn't the young attorney fighting to be heard, she was the law itself. He watched as she handled each case with measured grace, never rushing to judgment, never allowing the weight of her authority to cloud her empathy. She saw everyone. Even from the back of the room, Crawford could feel it. When the session ended, he waited, blending into the crowd. He wasn't sure if he would say anything, wasn't even sure why he had come. But before he could decide, Maya spotted him. She didn't look surprised. She walked over, arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corner of her lips. You're back in my courtroom, Your Honor. Crawford chuckled. I suppose I am. Maya studied him for a moment. So, tell me. Did I get it right? Crawford's smile softened. You made it better. She nodded, the smirk fading into something warmer. Good. A comfortable silence stretched between them before Maya reached into her robe and pulled out a small envelope. I was going to send this to you, but I had a feeling you'd show up. Crawford raised an eyebrow as he took it. Inside was an invitation. The United States Supreme Court. Maya Lawson had been nominated to the highest court in the country. Crawford swallowed, staring at the paper in his hands. He had spent a lifetime making decisions, handing down sentences, controlling the fate of others. But this moment? This was his greatest verdict. When he looked up, Maya was watching him, waiting. For once, he had no words. Only a deep, unwavering respect for the woman who had once been the girl he had mocked. She had changed the law. She had changed history. And, in the process, she had changed him. Crawford exhaled and tucked the invitation into his coat. Then, with a slow nod, he said the only thing that mattered. I'll be there. And for the first time in his life, he truly understood what justice looked like. The day of Maya Lawson's Supreme Court confirmation hearing arrived like the turning of a great tide, inevitable, powerful, history in motion. Judge William Crawford sat in the front row this time. No longer an observer from the shadows, no longer a man too proud to acknowledge what stood before him. The chamber was packed with politicians, journalists, legal scholars, some eager to see Maya rise, others desperate to see her fall. But she sat there, calm, unshaken, just as she had been all those years ago in his courtroom. The senators questioned her relentlessly. Some challenged her record, others tried to trap her in legal technicalities. But Maya met them with the same unwavering brilliance she had always possessed. Crawford smiled to himself. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Then, one senator leaned forward. Judge Lawson, do you believe that the law is always just? A loaded question. One meant to corner her. Maya's dark eyes flickered with something sharp, something that Crawford recognized. She took a measured breath. Then, in a voice that carried across the room, she said, "The law is not just because it exists. The law is just because we fight to make it so." Silence. And then, applause. Not from everyone. Not from the politicians who had long profited from injustice. But from those who understood. From those who had spent their lives demanding more. And from one old man in the front row, whose hands came together in quiet, steady applause. Judge Maya Lawson had won. Not just this confirmation. Not just her seat on the highest court in the country. She had won the right to define justice itself. The last conversation. That evening, as the Capitol building emptied, Maya stepped outside and found Crawford waiting beneath the marble columns. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Maya smirked. "You didn't fall asleep in there, did you?" Crawford chuckled. "Not even once." She studied him for a long moment, then asked, "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" Crawford let out a slow breath. No, he met her gaze. "But I'm damn glad we did." Maya nodded, then pulled something from her pocket, a folded piece of paper, old and slightly worn. She handed it to him. Crawford unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words. It was a copy of his first ruling against her. The case where he had mocked her. Dismissed her. At the bottom, in her handwriting, she had scribbled something new. "People can change." Crawford exhaled sharply, a lump forming in his throat. He looked up at her, his voice quieter than before. "You believed that?" Maya smiled. "I had to." A pause. A lifetime of history in a single moment. Then, she reached out her hand. Not as a student to a teacher. Not as a young lawyer to an old judge. But as an equal. Crawford took it, their handshake firm, filled with something words could never fully capture. And for the first time in his life, William Crawford realized that his greatest ruling had not come from the bench. It had come from the moment he chose to listen. The moment he chose to change. And as he walked away, leaving behind a courthouse that now belonged to someone far greater than himself, he knew. Justice had finally found its rightful place. The verdict of fate was complete.